So I'm Charlie Brown. I'm tonight's moderator. I'm also the CEO of Context Partners. We're an agency here in town that helps our clients get closer to their customers. That means we design community and network-based strategies that help them get their employees, their customers, vendors, grantees, general enthusiasts and fans closer to their brand and really get them to take action to solve real-world problems. A core part of what we do, community management. So that's why we're really excited for tonight, and we feel like we've got 4 great panelists who are going to teach us a lot and hopefully provide a lot of insights for each of you that is attending. But before we get started, I want to address a couple of aspects for tonight. First, some of you are probably asking, where's Kevin? And even though Kevin has already shown himself at least 5 times in the first 30 seconds, which is a little telling, over the past few months, we've been collaborating with a few new sponsors. We've been coming up with new topic ideas together. We've been thinking about new ways to actually innovate for Innovate in Motion. And what's been core to that, just has been core to Innovation in Motion over the past months and really over the year, is Kevin. So you're going to see different moderators come up during the upcoming sessions, new topics, probably change a little bit of the definition of where it's gone, but I think each of us who's been brought here consistently over owes Kevin a big thank you. So I'd like to start off by thanking Kevin Long for founding Innovation in Motion and for continually bringing us together. Secondly, I want to thank all the sponsors. So we have 4 sponsors tonight. Context Partners, organization I'm with, CorSource, Crowd Compass, and the Technology Association of Oregon. So I want to invite each one of them up to give a quick 15-minute session or speech on what they do in their organization. And I think we'll start with Kristen. 15-second. Yeah, we're not doing 15 minutes. You are going to be here all night.
I was going to say, I can go now.
Yeah. We're not even getting to the panelists. So is Kristen from Crowd Compass here? Great.
So welcome. It's great to see all of you here tonight. I'm actually the corporate recruiter for Crowd Compass, and we are doing some major hiring in terms of technology and on our business side. So if you know of anybody looking, do direct them toward Crowd Compass and our website. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Kristen. Skip, are you out there as well? Here comes Skip.
I'm Skip Newberry, president of the Technology Association of Oregon, and I also have with me our VP of Business Development, Amy Choi, in the back here, and Daniel Lee as well, who's in charge of our database and operations. So just wanted to say this has been a fantastic series to support. We first got involved back in March of this past year, and we're going to continue to provide some support into the coming year, and we have a lot of exciting programming ideas that this group has put together that we're squarely behind. So it looks like a great panel tonight, and thank you again.
And is Dan here from CorSource? Calling Dan. Dan may not be here yet, so maybe at the end we'll call him up. And I'm Charlie Brown, as I said, from Context Partners. We've been really excited to sponsor some of the events, and we're excited to drive the community management theme of tonight. We've got quite a few team members here, from Davey up front. Jen is somewhere around here, who's our hiring manager and has a bunch of job openings. There she is, waving those openings. And Jency, who's out front here and is going to be manning these slides for tonight. So thanks to all of our sponsors. We really appreciate the collaboration they work with us on and putting this together to make a great event. And lastly, I want to thank all of you for coming. Certainly, as we talk about community management, this is a community. It's interesting to see how this has emerged as really a community of practice on marketing, innovation, technology, and all related things. So it's fun to come back every month, see the same faces, see new faces that get added in, and we'll be looking for your participation, as always, towards the end of the evening to get really great questions and challenge our panelists in ways that I or all of us up here may not have thought of. So let's jump into it. We've got 4 panelists here tonight. Some of you may have noted that Laura Adams from Nike's digital brand strategy group was going to be here tonight. Unfortunately, she had a death in the family, so couldn't join us. So instead of having 3 panelists, we thought that we would add a 4th, bring you like that extra punch. So we have 4 fantastic panelists. Hopefully you'll get a great broad spectrum of insights tonight. And we're going to let them jump into it with really quick introductions. And I think we'll probably just start at the end and go down the line. So Alisa.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Alisa Zwanger. I'm with Mambo Media. I've been in marketing now for 12 years, and the last 5 years have really focused on online marketing in many different channels. I've been with Mambo for 3 years. Our clients include OHSU, Temp, PSU, high-tech footwear, and I design the online marketing and brand advocacy programs for a number of these clients and have been doing so for quite a few years now. And really, I direct the community managers so that they can have meaningful interactions with them.
Perfect. Melissa.
Hi, my name is Melissa Barker. I'm the Enterprise Community Manager for Jive Software. So I actually manage the internal community at Jive Software. And a little bit about my background. I recently co-authored the first college textbook on social media marketing, which I have a copy of here to give to whoever asks the best question at the end. I've done social media strategy for a variety of tech companies and community management as well. A little bit more about Jive. So I think they're really the pioneer in the enterprise social business software industry. They've been around for 11 years, and we have customers such as Nike and Cisco.
Perfect. Dawn.
I'm Dawn Foster. I've been working with communities for about a dozen years, so my specialty has always been open source communities and developer communities, which have been around for a very long time. I'm currently at Puppet Labs. I've been there for a week, so it's still fairly new. It's a great company, though. I'm super excited. Before that, I was the community lead for Intel's Open Source Technology Center, and I was a community manager at Jive, amongst other places. So I'm actually the one on this panel who has no marketing background whatsoever.
Which will make for interesting insights. Tyler.
Hi, I am Tyler Ahn. I work for Context Partners with Charlie. I'm usually the PowerPoint girl, but tonight I'm actually up here and talking to you all. I have been with, Context Partners for about 2 years doing community management for not quite a decade, mostly around communities of social change and innovative solutions around social issues. The kind of brands that we work with at Context is, let's rattle off a couple. Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals, the Knight Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and we just help them get closer to their community, whether that is a group of clinical trial scientists or Black men in Philly and Detroit, and much more.
So the question that, as I talked to several people before this panel, came up was, what exactly is community management? And there were lots of incredibly diverse points of view on exactly what that meant and what it is. So I thought it was only appropriate for us to start off with asking the question, what is community management? And maybe equally, what is it not? So Dawn, why don't you maybe give us your point of view?
Yeah, so I see community management as, so let me back up. So I see communities as a group of people who are trying to accomplish something together, or who have, some kind of a shared bond. So if you think about in your local community, you have a shared bond because of where you live. Or some of these online communities, you have a shared bond because of what you're trying to accomplish together, what you're trying to learn from each other. So I see that as being the basis of community, and then community management is around that and helping facilitate those interactions. So I generally think of community management as, only when you're talking about a group of people who really share something. So if you're just talking about maybe something that's, if you're talking about Twitter as a whole, I don't see that as a community. I do see little groups of people within social media who are acting like a community. But I think we need to be careful to separate the tools from the process of community management.
And for others that are up here, what isn't community management? We heard that a tool is not community management. Are there other things that you feel are not community management? And I'm just going to leave that open.
It's interesting because as a marketer, I bring a marketing lens to these online communities, which I think online in particular is unique from other communities that happen offline. There's a set of practices, etiquette, status that happens in these communities online each and every day. And I think community management or online communities in general are not a sales tool. They are a place to attract potential customers and retain current customers if you want to apply a marketing lens to what they are. Can be used as sources to distribute news and information that is actually relevant to the set audience. But I do think quite a bit, if you're not using it to build a relationship, essentially you're really cutting the channel and that community short. And also ultimately your marketing efforts. I mean, it really is about building more meaningful online relationships.
And it seems to me that's probably a key for everything that's happening in community management. What are you doing? You're building a relationship. And it's that new way of building a relationship at mass. It's building it to the many versus maybe a one-to-one. But it seems that there's still aspects of community management that are effective maybe offline, which is that complement to certainly what you were talking about, and can sometimes be maybe higher touch, maybe not so traditional in the way that we all have begun to think about it through a means of technology. Tyler, I know this is something you do a lot about. Any thoughts on the actual offline elements of community management?
So I think whether it's online or offline, it really, as everybody's echoed, it's about relationships, whether it's one-on-one, one-to-many, and actually across the community members themselves. So what I find really effective when we bring people together in person, I don't often see communities just arise out of nowhere in the middle of the interwebs. It actually started in real life. I'm friends with my friends, and then I friend them on Facebook, or I meet someone at a conference and we share hashtags or, Twitter handles or what have you. So, and I feel like it's kind of a reinforcing mechanism where offline relationships really help strengthen online communities. And, when you try to really push one thing without the other, I don't see that always being super successful.
Don, you're nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to, as much as you possibly can, having both an online and an offline component is really powerful. So we do this in tech communities with, conferences or meetups or, camps, something like that. But so it does help strengthen it, but I would say that the offline component is not necessarily needed. The Linux kernel community, for example, some of the top people had never met each other for the first couple of years that they worked on it. And they were building a whole, kernel of an operating system, which is pretty fantastic. And then in some communities, there's, a sensitive nature that you wouldn't want to meet in, real life because there's some, a medical issue or there's all of these other communities.
Yeah, even in a tech community, I mean, to hear from Don that even they still have some offline sort of, let's say, bonding or relational sort of convergences is really interesting because that would have been the last place where I would have expected that.
And so in your work, where you're definitely building online communities, you're dealing a lot with social media, and that's why people are coming to you. Are they asking for offline events as well?
I would say the clients are, as an extension. So it used to be that we'd have these in real life or these offline brand experiences, and my job used to be to bring them to life on the internet, and now it's the total reverse. Now I'm building communities and messaging and social media marketing programs around these communities, and I'm getting requests to do these, to facilitate a conference or a user group meeting or even a flash mob. I had one client ask me, and I was like, okay. They're like, but, we have all these advocates, all these people who love us, let's hit the streets sort of thing. So it's a really interesting progression, I think.
Right, it almost seems like the fascinating aspect is if we had this same meeting 2 years ago, or maybe even less, everybody would have been talking about their clients, saying, how do I get everybody online? And now we're actually talking about how do we get them offline and how do we get them back in person. So hopefully this gives a little bit of context about what is community management, what is it not. Probably that next logical question is, so what would a community manager do in an average day? What do you actually have to do on a practical operational basis? So Melissa, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happens at Jive?
Yeah, so I actually manage the internal community, but I also manage our external community on LinkedIn. So my day is a little bit split up between the two. In terms of the internal community management on a daily basis, the main thing that I do every day is trying to lead by example. So being active as much as I can, being responsive, because that's, I think, one of the most important things as a community manager. You have to be that first person to respond and be the quickest one there. So even if you don't have the answer, a lot of times what I spend time doing is connecting people with the right people to answer their question. So I'll go through and look at all the discussions marked as questions and then connect them with the appropriate person. I think another really important part of that is trying to insert yourself in very authentic ways. And as someone with a marketing background, I'm not necessarily going to be really active in like a product group, right? That's not my expertise, and that wouldn't be an authentic engagement. So something that I do to try and interact with people, say on the product side or in different departments, is I will scroll through all the status updates each morning and see, how can I just say something or give them like a high five, you know, the equivalent of a high five online being a like, of course. Or a comment or something to just make sure that I'm inserted in those conversations to the best of my abilities. Another key component of my day is really reaching out to people who can be those natural advocates in those different communities or groups rather within the community that I don't necessarily have that knowledge base in, and really empower them to be successful. So give them the tools. You know, maybe that means creating a private group where I have a couple thought leaders in the different departments and we talk about how to really drive discussion in a very effective manner throughout the community. So that's kind of what I do on the internal side. In terms of like the external community, it's a little bit more seeding discussions and trying to get really good strategic discussions going in our LinkedIn group. So I try and get in there, respond to people, and start discussions that I think will be relevant to them.
So you're talking about an internal group of staff, and you're talking about also an external
and then
group.
External. I also do a little bit of external with our LinkedIn community, so that's something else that I manage as well.
And you're really looking at both staff and then customers, it sounds like.
Yes, definitely.
So how does that compare, Dawn, to managing a group of developers?
Yeah, so my interactions are probably a little bit different because our communities are based in tools like mailing lists and IRC channels, which is basically a big, giant, obnoxious chat room. And bug trackers and code repositories. So the stuff that we do is a little bit different, but a lot of the community really revolves around the mailing list. So that's where people generally talk about issues. So I spend a lot of time going through email and seeing what people are saying and highlighting things that I think are going to be issues that we need to talk about internally, or pointing people in the right direction if there's somebody they should be talking to that they're not already talking to. And then carving out time for planning, looking at where do we need to make improvements, how do we find time to do that, what's the strategy long term, are we in a position to actually get there, and what do we need to do differently. So it's always this weird mix of tactical stuff and then strategic planning that you need to do for the community. And the fun thing about community management is it's totally different every single day, and you never know when something's going to blow up and trash your whole schedule, and depending on where your community is kind of drives your schedule as well. When I was doing a community that had a lot of European participation, all morning I was doing the tactical triage stuff, and I had this really nice chunk of time towards the end of the day where I could do the strategic things.
So one of the things you said, Melissa, is this idea of the first responder. And after hearing you, Dawn, it almost sounds like you're like a emergency first responder, first one on a crime scene, having to deal with some type of chaotic situation that could get worse and worse, and your job is to manage it into the worst case or the best case scenario, or actually turn it into an opportunity. Is that a fair description?
I actually try not to be the first person to respond because the communities that I manage, the people are incredibly supportive, and so I would rather have them supporting each other and not have to jump in unless I really need to. If something's escalating out of control, then I'll certainly jump in. If there's somebody needs a quick pointer to a document that I know exactly where it is, I'll jump in. But I actually tend to wait, and I'd rather have the engineers who are working on the code reply to people's technical questions than for me to do it, or have other peers who are people who are using our software reply to the question.
And what do you do, and maybe this is just an open question, what do you do when no one's replying? Because certainly one of the challenges, and I think we've all seen online communities that are there, they're present, and they feel dead. And you go inside and there's no activity, and you're like, where's the life here? So in some instances, it sounds like that life is really thriving and you're almost inserting yourself into a community. But what do you do when there is no community and maybe you've got to really bring them to life?
At least in my instance, what I try and do, the great thing about Jive, and at least in the internal community, as well as the external customer communities, you can mention specific people like you would on Twitter, and so it'll pop up in their inbox. So if I see that there's no response to a discussion that really needs an answer, I'll maybe mention a couple of people to bring it to their attention. In terms of like an external community, like something like LinkedIn, it is more difficult. And sometimes the best thing to do is really to get a couple of people on your team and say, hey, you know what, we need a few extra faces in there. Let's brainstorm some content and have a content calendar so we have regular posting from different faces.
Alisa?
Yeah, I think to bridge both of these preceding questions, Janelle's here. Janelle works at Mambo. She's our star community manager, works on several of our accounts. You can ask her what her day-to-day duties are. But what I see this role really evolving into is more of a content strategist and really taking on more of an editorial capacity. So it's not just retweeting people, it's not just plus oneing them, it's not just boosting their clout score, it actually is determining the sort of content that is really going to resonate and maybe even surprise a little bit in order to reinvigorate or just interest a community, which is, you know, just a group of people. So if that community isn't there and if it's really not thriving online, I would put forth that either one, your editorial strategy needs to really be revisited, perhaps refined, or two, maybe you haven't really targeted and identified that potential community well to begin with.
Right, and one of the words that comes to mind as I hear you talk is curator.
Yeah.
And it's everywhere we go and every time we're talking about communities, people say, well, what's the role of a curator? Or we bring up the word curator and people either cringe, they're like, oh, I don't want to be a curator.
Yes.
Or they're like, oh, I would love to be a curator. But that seems to be kind of that role you're defining, is that right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, it absolutely is. It's like curator-in-chief is essentially the new community manager.
Curator-in-chief, it's probably a job title people wouldn't mind having. It's pretty cool. So I think one of the other things that we've seen happen a lot is this idea of you got to run campaigns, and what's the role of campaigns in communities, building communities or mobilizing them. Tyler, I know it's something that you do a ton of. So tell us a little bit maybe about how you look at campaigns and their role for communities.
So I think a lot of our clients come to us saying, actually, we want to tap into a community or build a network. So a lot of the work that I do revolves around actually running recruitment campaigns, whether they be around kind of ideas, challenges, or marketing campaigns, or SMS campaigns, what have you. And what the approach that I've taken is actually planting community managers in the places in the world where our clients want to bring community members in from. So folks in Bangkok, Nairobi, Dakar, what have you. And so now I'm overseeing a community of community managers that have the direct pulse of what the community wants, what the community needs, and based on all of the benefits that can go in one direction or the other, you're devising rewards and incentives that will get people enticed and give them the hook to get involved. And the whole process then becomes a conversion, ladder of engagement, kind of your typical marketing lingo. But it's giving them an excuse to start that relationship with your brand or your company or organization.
And so as you think about the idea of having community managers not just in one place managing sort of one predefined audience or target community member, but really all over the world. We heard Dawn talk a little bit about how it actually worked to her benefit because she got a little bit of an afternoon where she got to plan, which probably doesn't always happen for pretty much any of us, whether managing community or not. How do you manage community managers when they're spread all over the world?
You sleep very little. Your day starts really early, especially being on PST. It kind of sucks. So you're up at 5 and you're on the phone with them. You're answering questions that came overnight or directing, making sure that people that need attention are directed to the right places and to the right people that can give them the attention that they need. I think the challenge for having communities that are global, and that's kind of the primary audience that I've been working with, it is the ability to have endurance and ability to be super energy all the time. But the rewards are, especially in the communities that we work in, pays dividends, so it keeps you strong.
So what do you mean by that, rewards?
So I ran this Twitter conference for the Rockefeller Foundation. It was a 7-hour nonstop Twitter chat around farmers, engaging young farmers, making sure not all our farmers die off, irrigation, and how do we use data to improve lives in cities. And when I sent the notice out to some 300-400 guys that had come through this innovation challenge that we ran, they're like, you know, I don't know what Twitter is, but I'm going to sign up today, and I want to be a part of this conversation. So when you hear that, you're like, fuck yeah, that's awesome. And so that's kind of the rewards that there's small victories, and you don't always, it's not always something measurable that you tell your clients, but it puts a little skip in your step.
So part of what you're talking about, and I think part of what we're hearing, is there is this really clear link to marketing, and there's a really confused set of questions that we see clients, organizations, everyone have about what is the difference between marketing and community. Is there a difference? Are the techniques the same? We heard a little bit about don't confuse community with the tools that can manage a community, but maybe we can hit it a little bit more head on. And Alisa, this is really core for what Mambo does and what you do on a day-to-day basis. So what's the difference, or how do you sort of define that traditional marketing versus community management?
Yeah, working in the field for as long as I have and pursuing it in education, I really think that those fundamentals, the marketing communications fundamentals and frameworks come out every single day in my work, and I think it feeds into the approaches. But again, I do think that you have to adapt, both to the channel and then to your audience. But fundamentals such as positioning, fundamentals such as, what are you saying that your competitors aren't saying? How does your tone differ? What is the best approach to actually connect with these people? Real basic, it's like the 4 Ps, right? Real basic fundamentals that really still affect, I'd say marketing probably just flows in to my community management and marketing programs.
Yeah, and in my community, it's really fairly separate because the marketing team manages the blog, they manage the Twitter account, they manage the social media. And then I'm in community, and I don't sit in marketing, I sit in a technical organization, and I handle all of the mailing lists, the IRC, all of the community management around this technical community, but I'm tied very closely into marketing because one of the worst things you can have is, marketing is going off in one direction with a certain position, and your community manager is saying something that's,
You're the number one advocate. I mean, it is, I saw in the write-up, there's debate whether or not they're a spokesperson or not. And I do think, you're front line at that point, and it goes back to sort of the modeling that you were talking about of leading by example.
So how many of your clients just at Mambo come and have separate community, separate marketing, and they're not even talking to each other?
0.
How many of them actually have a focus on community? 0.
No, they do. They're very concerned about their core audience and really keeping them happy. So I would say 50% of them. But those are generally either professional communicators or marketers who are really, they're really managing those communities on the client side.
We did a webinar earlier this week with a group of international organizations that all focus on the role of communities or networks in their strategies. And one of the things that a panelist said, which I thought was really smart, an audience member asked a question about what is a similar question, sort of what's the role of communications and community? And the answer she gave back was, well, every great community starts with the 101 of communications. Yeah. And that sounds a lot of what you said. Yep. If you don't get those basics right of who's in your community, why are they there, what's the point, what proposition are you actually offering them from a value standpoint, you're probably not going to be successful.
That's right.
So one of the other questions that comes up, and maybe digging back into that idea of the tools, certainly one of the key tenets of community management that is continually confused is, well, we manage a Twitter feed and we've got a Facebook page, so obviously we've got a community.
Right.
And I think that's probably, most of us would say, well, not quite, or maybe not. Tyler, maybe the real question inside of there is social media a channel or a community?
I think social media is definitely a channel, but communities do, as Don mentioned, they do exist within the bigger pool of Twitter users, Facebook users. I think the KitchenAid guy got fired yesterday, right?
Who did?
Yeah, because he said, something about Obama's grandma. So definitely in a sense of that nature, I think with the advent of the web, new channels have come about. So people are used to radio, people are used to newspaper, people are used to TV, and now Twitter and Facebook and things of that nature, they're like, okay, it's kind of akin to that. I want to say X, and I'm going to blurt it out. Except now they're realizing, oh, actually people can talk back to us and give us reaction, and it actually impacts our brand. So that's just kind of channel management. But building a relationship with someone is so much more than just telling them something you want to say. It's listening to them, reacting, refining, and giving kind of the whole full circle. I mean, many of you probably be married. You know what a relationship is like. I think communities are really micro, macro at the core. It's relationships, whether it's one-on-one or 1 to a million.
No one should be talking bad about anybody's grandma. That should be just like the fundamental starting point.
I like how I got sacked, yeah.
So proper response, I guess.
But you know, it would not have happened 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's a rapidly changing world.
In a scenario where Jive, you're actually managing a software tool that could be, perceived as that tool. Is it the tool or is it the community? And I would imagine you have clients who sometimes come to you thinking, well, we paid for the tool. It's a community, right? It just naturally follows. How do you manage that conversation, or how do you guys approach that?
I think that really the tool is actually a community. I sort of disagree in that I think that social media is a community. I think that Twitter, for example, kind of going off topic a little, but I think Twitter is definitely a community, and you can build a community there as a brand. I think that what that requires is not just that corporate voice, but having like your executives involved in conversations, having members from your company actively involved, and maybe that community is built around like a hashtag. Like right now, we're coming up to our biggest user conference, Jive World, next week, and I really feel that we are building a community on Twitter. I mean, we've got so many people interacting using the hashtag JW12, and what they'll do is they'll say, hey, who's going to this? And then other community members are saying, I'm going to this, and they're facilitating meetups through that hashtag. So I think that actually the tool can be a community in itself. In terms of Jive itself and how do we approach that conversation, I think it really takes a strategic look at it to really build a community. It's not just, oh, we deployed it, it's a community. You have to have somebody doing a lot of strategy. And I actually think I have a slide here which speaks to this a little bit. So actually the next one. There we go. Okay, so I think the role of the community manager is to build that community. No, the tool by itself is not a community, but with this kind of strategic look at how to use it as a community and how to build that community, I think it can be. And some of the pillars there that I really just want to speak to is that first one is that building that community and why you need someone with that strategic mind building your community. That doesn't mean just setting goals. That means creating groups around what you're looking for. Like for instance with Jive, what we're looking to do is we're looking to get as much feedback on topics as possible. So we're going to create groups and create them in such a structure that we allow for a lot of feedback. So maybe that means groups with a lot of polls, or we have active discussions going where people can respond and we can get that feedback. But I think that, yes, the tool by itself is not a community, but it can be very easily turned into one, as with Twitter.
I think you especially get the problem when people lead with the tools. So I was doing community consulting a few years ago, and I would have clients come to me, potential clients, and they would say, hey, I want you to help us do Twitter and Facebook. Or I just bought this very expensive community platform and installed it, and now it helped me with my strategy. I'm like, you could have done strategy before you purchased the big expensive tool to figure out what you wanted. But I always back them way up, and I would say, hey, well, let's talk about what are you trying to accomplish? What are your corporate goals? What are your marketing goals? What are the goals for this community? And then we'll talk about which tools are going to be most appropriate for you. Yeah. But people get really excited about tools.
Yes.
And as a technologist, I'll admit I get excited about tools.
But if you build it, they will come, right?
Yes.
I mean, come on.
That's the way it works.
Well, and that's probably an amazingly true phrase that comes up over and over. If you build it, they will come. And I would imagine that all of us in this room have been faced at some point with the problem of having a community, a client, or maybe a boss or colleague that says, no, if we just keep building it, this thing's going to work, or they lose sight of it. Yeah. So it would be interesting, Alisa, to hear, how do you keep a client focused on what it takes to build a community and not sort of get distracted by the shiny objects or whatever the latest fad is.
Yeah. I just regularly consult. I just feel like so much of my role now is more educational and kind of just, again, laying out those basics and actually just advising them. I had a very high-profile nonprofit client that really wanted to build an amazing website that was going to impart this social change message. It was going to cost a couple $100,000, and I just had to basically school them and educate in terms of how this actually works and what the trends are with destination websites. So it's very consultative, but not scolding. I try and really just kind of take them through best practices and what I'm seeing out there as I work actively with this.
And how do you take the reverse of that when an organization's maybe in a really prime position to build an incredible community? They've got all of the opportunities sitting in front of them, but they've got a CEO or a CMO who doesn't really believe in it. How do you demonstrate the real value of what a community is going to mean for them in a return on investment?
Yeah, we actually, at Mambo, we have a whole deck dedicated to CEOs and social media, and actually show the competitive value of the socially integrated enterprise, meaning the big thing about social media, and Tyler spoke a little bit to this, the big revolution was access. Before, you used to have to call customer service and then ask them and then wait on hold or whatever. Now, with social media, with Twitter, with blogs, I have direct access to that CEO. I have direct access to the developer who actually worked on the product that I'm using. So I think that with CEOs and just the C-suite in general, no doubt they get it. They understand it from a marketing potential. I don't know if they understand it from a bottom line and how it ultimately affects their business potential. And a lot of that is, it's stats driven, and then also just showing successful case studies in terms of the lift. Anytime you can show, a lift, then it's pretty persuasive.
Same at Jive?
Definitely.
Yeah.
No, I think that a lot of times you have to prove that value. I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen the McKinsey report that just came out.
Yeah.
Pretty big deal. So, I mean, those kind of numbers, having those numbers to back it up and really convince like that C-suite level that you're talking about, I think is really critical. One of the stats that came to mind is on average, workers spend 28 hours a week looking for the content that they need to do their job. So social collaboration, like social business software, eliminates 50% of what your employees are doing during a week. And I think it's those kind of statistics that really shock people and realize what the power of social is and the power of having these communities can really be. So.
Is it the same when you're doing a developer community? I mean, are you having to prove as much about the value? Are you having to convince people? Or is that a different side of the organization when maybe you've got a CIO or a CTO who's coming to you?
It depends entirely on the community and the companies that are involved. I've worked with online communities. Well, how do I say this delicately? Sometimes,
don't say that.
sometimes big companies, it's very, very difficult to get buy-in at the executive level for, especially for open source communities where you've got all this transparency where people reply to the mailing list using their corporate email address. You know exactly who they are, what they're saying. It can be very, very difficult to get that kind of corporate buy-in at very large conservative companies.
And so how do you get it?
It just depends. I mean, some of the companies I've worked with have been, Fortune 50 companies, and at that level, I'm not going to be able to talk to the CEO to convince him of something. So it just depends on the community. Honestly, a big part of why I took the job at Puppet Labs is because the CEO, Luke, really gets community. He understands why it's important. It's a key focus for the company, and it's a great environment for a community manager to work in.
And so we've been talking a lot about what is community management, how do you actually make it work. One of the things that we haven't necessarily talked about, but you've certainly heard from each of these four panelists, is what makes a great community manager. And something we often have clients come to us for is to say, I've got a community, it's there, we have no idea how to manage it in the long run, so help us build our own capacity or team. So maybe it'd be good to talk quickly about what are the qualities of a great community manager, and Melissa, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay. So I think some of the great qualities of a community manager, first, that strategic mindset. No, this is not something your intern can do. That's definitely what a lot of people assume initially with social media. It's like, oh, that's something the intern can do, right? They can tweet or talk to people occasionally. So I think having that strategic mindset, first of all. Second, really organized. I think that's a critical part of being a community manager, having a very systematic approach to the way that you do it, especially as your community grows. I think the third component is really understanding how to give people what they need to be successful, because the community manager, I think, like what Dawn said, you can't be in every conversation, and we shouldn't necessarily be in every conversation. So someone who understands how to empower your natural advocates to really get in there and help make your community successful.
Other thoughts on great qualities for a community manager?
They can't sleep, just insomniacs. I hire insomniacs.
That's why I hired Tyler. She's up like
Sounds like
it's
it.
crazy.
5 to
Jacked
7.
up on caffeine. Yeah. I think being strategic on the other side of that is like you should be able to get the 30,000 feet and then like the 5-foot level at the same time. Being a strategic planner, but also a very tactical implementer, for me is key when I look for a community manager. Another is, I think being a community manager means you're oftentimes in this gray space. So you want to always be relational, but also professional.
Yeah.
Towing that line. I tend to be more relational than professional sometimes, but it happens. And some things you just can't teach. It's like, how well of a connector are you? And you just see people doing this in a room. I think that's kind of the thing that I look for. Somebody kind of is the buzz in a space.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing. I always look for the person who knows everybody in the particular space. So I hired a community manager when I was at Intel to manage a particular embedded community, and he knew everybody that worked in embedded software. He knew all the companies, all the people, and he was just a fantastic, a connector in that community because he was one of those people who knew everybody. But I also actually look for people who have really varied, diverse backgrounds, who've done a bunch of different things, because the role of community manager, it's never the same. So as you can hear from the four of us, we do completely different things. And so depending on the type of community you're managing, the person that you bring into that role has to be flexible enough to adapt over time. So the community that you start managing, the community that I'm managing right now at Puppet Labs, is going to be different in 2 years. And I need to be able to adapt to that. I need to be able to have a varied background.
The other thing that I would just add that I haven't heard spoken is you got to get to know them. It's almost like a certain empathy. Who is your audience? What are their pain points? What makes them tick? And I just think that, or what appeals to them. And it's almost, again, it's a little bit human, but I've seen several marketers, who treat this not organically and as if, again, it's just another press release or something along those lines. And I really look for that person who, for lack of a better, does have some sort of emotional intelligence in addition to any other kind of editorial, technical proficiency.
Yeah.
And I still talk to people that were in communities that I managed, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yep. Yeah, me too.
I'll jump in as a quasi-panelist for a second. We actually built a site for government healthcare workers. Very similar situation. They're all afraid that any comments on Obamacare are going to lead to a political scandal and everyone's going to lose their job and it's just going to be some major crisis. So we created an online community that allowed them to facilitate just knowledge sharing. And then we did these offline events that were closed door, for very specific groups that were less than 20, and people just laid it out. And for them, it was almost like therapeutic. But it's that idea of it's got to be both offline and online in those instances. So there were a lot of hands. I want to get to some other questions. I'm going to go to the back one more time, and then we'll work my way up. Blue shirt, beard.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of the clients are larger corporations. Does this also work for small to medium-sized businesses?
So the question is, we're talking a lot about maybe large corporations. What about small to medium-sized businesses? And maybe, Melissa, let's jump to you, because that maybe, you guys probably have a broad cross-cut of audiences for Jive.
Yeah, and I've actually, a couple roles ago, I worked with a startup, and I was trying to build a community for them. I mean, there was 10 people in the company. So it's definitely, these strategies do work. They take more effort, though, and more one-to-one relationship building than you would actually think. I think the key thing as you're a smaller business is, you know, again, that offline and bridging it to online, letting people know, finding different avenues to promote your community, and making sure that you do enough research beforehand and that you're giving the right content to your target audience. So like the more you can drill down on what that exact persona is that you're looking at, like what type of person and what type of information they're interested in, the better. And even if that's as simple as doing like a focus group, very traditional marketing stuff, doing a focus group and finding out what kind of information do you want to hear about, not about my company, but what kind of information will make you better at your job that somewhat relates to my company. And I think that that strategy still can work for smaller businesses.
Another question. I'm actually going to lie. I'm going to jump right to the front and with the blue scarf.
Hey, so I am with Jive, full disclosure, but my question is actually about my time at Disney. So I spent 3.5 years with Disney Parks in marketing, just left there in June, and one of the struggles that we had is that obviously our fans were very fervent, and they had well-established communities from like 1997 forums, right? Like really old communities, but yet Disney obviously wanted to be at the forefront of a lot of those conversations. So what was always the struggle was, do we infiltrate the 1997 kind of forums, very established community, or do we go off and build our own? And you know, we always had this very fractured strategy, to be perfectly honest. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on, do you go into an established community, or do you go onto your own, or is there some sort of hybrid?
So just to rephrase that, this is an interesting question. So from an experience at Disney where you had this long-standing community that may have been back to 1997 in some old forum that somehow still exists, it could even go even further back than that, very fractured, maybe doesn't represent the brand that you really want to have, and maybe it's not getting the full potential out of them. Do you go in and infiltrate that community and try to convert them over to something else, or do you try to build something maybe that's over on the other side and attract them over, or something to that effect? And Alisa, you might have to deal with this in your day-to-day job, so maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I go where my audience is, and so I generally, if there are hot spots where they are hanging out, if they are on mailing lists, I generally will go to them and try and bring them in. I think that's what I would do. I would like, obviously, to really, get to know this customer and whatnot. But again, if your goal, which I think your goal should be, is to build advocacy and really participation, then going where they are is critical.
Any other differing points of view on that, or reinforcement?
No, I would agree with Alisa and say maybe not infiltrate. And whenever we have clients that want to start off on the community, it's like it's very important for you as a brand to be a part of the community and not just someone that steers it or dictates anything to the members.
So we're running up against time. We're going to do one more question. Let's see the hands. I'm going to, just because the lights are bright and I can't see very far, I'm going to go to another blue shirt right here in the front. Yes, please. So when you start to decide you're going to build a community and you're getting at that onset, you're ready to launch, how do you decide what tool and how many tools? Because we've been saying don't rely on just one tool, but also don't make it about the tool. So we may have sent a little bit of confusing message. So let's clear this up. Let's clear this up before we head out of here tonight. And maybe this one we'll kind of hear from everybody as a parting comment. And maybe we'll go back and Alisa, start with you.
I just use what works. I don't have an authoritative answer on this.
Use what works. Good answer. Melissa?
I think it depends on what your goals are. I think if your goal is to, say, like do lead generation, I think you want to try a couple of different tools and not rely on one tool. So maybe you want to look at building some relationships on LinkedIn, maybe like 2 to 3 tools. I never recommend starting with more than 3 by any means, depending on how many people you have working on it, because you can very easily spread yourself too thin. And I think the worst case scenario would be to have a number of properties, online properties, where you only have maybe 1 update a week. So I think it depends more on the goal, how many communities, and definitely depends on how many people you have there to man it. If you've got a big amount of people, you've got like 3 community managers, by all means, start a couple communities on a couple different platforms.
Don?
Yeah, I would agree. The fact that you really need to start with the goals and the strategy and what you're trying to accomplish and figure out which tools you need and how many of them you need to accomplish that. But you also need to look at the audience and what tools they're most comfortable with. So, with me, for developer communities, we have kind of a standard set of tools that I talked about earlier. But, if you're managing a community full of, retired people who are doing a particular thing, then maybe the tools that you use are different than the tools that you'd use if you're managing a community of 20-somethings who do triathlons, based on the tools that the audience themselves are most comfortable with.
Tyler, final word here.
All the fabulous ladies have said everything I wanted to say. It's strategy, goals, audience, and you determine the tools thereafter. Yeah.
So as we close up tonight, we do have a parting celebration gift that Melissa has brought. So the panel here gets to choose the best question asked today, and that's who gets this instruction book on social media marketing. But I want to let you know it's not just the instruction book, it is the instructor's manual, so it probably has all the answers to all the tests. Super convenient, so you can trick all your friends at work about that one.
And there is some community management stuff in there.
So what best question, what you thought was maybe the most relevant for takeaways and everybody? Come on, be judgmental.
And then we can't, I was like, oh, the Jive lady, she probably has a copy. Okay.
All right.
I sit across from her.
What about you guys? Why don't we, by applause? Should we do the classic
by applause.
talent
So
shot?
I'm going to throw out a few.
Okay.
Who's going to say? Well, let's go backwards. Which tool do you start with? And let's hear some applause for who thought that was the best one. All right. I'm already forgetting all the questions. What about the one on Facebook? And whether or not that messages are getting through. First one that we had. All right, come on, you guys need more enthusiasm here.
Seriously.
Everybody had good questions. Small and medium-sized enterprises and the effectiveness of community.
All right.
I think we have a winner.
I think we have a winner.
Kevin.
Well, wait, there's also the hard question about which of your communities have failed.
Oh, which of your communities have failed? So we have our winner. I believe she's back there by the light. Come and accept your prize here at the end of the day. Thank everybody for coming. Great panel. We're super excited. You've got these panelists here, and I'm sure a bunch of great insights from the audience. We're going to continue to have some beers, continue to network, keep connecting and building this community. Is that here, Kevin, or is that downstairs?
Downstairs beers, and we're looking for the most innovative way to stack the chair.
Oh, so interesting. So there's a second competition, although I don't think Kevin has a prize.
No prize.
Kevin has his own textbook coming out next month, so you can get that one. So it's going to be downstairs. There's going to be some beers, people continuing to network. Please join us, hang out. Come and meet the panelists, talk to our sponsors and the folks that are probably doing some recruiting, talking about the tools they use. And Kevin does have some sort of contest that sounds super fun for stacking chairs. So thanks everybody for coming. We will see you at the next Innovation in Motion.